On June the 3rd, 1998, a high-speed Deutsche Bahn train travelling at nearly 200 kilometers per hour derailed and crashed into a road bridge near the village of Eschede in northern Germany, killing 101 and injuring 100. It was the worst rail disaster in the history of Germany and the most catastrophic high-speed train crash ever recorded. What went wrong with Intercity Express, or I.C.E. 884 Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen, as it hurtled along its route between Munich and Hamburg? Incredibly, the disaster was set in motion by a single, tiny fatigue crack. The crack unraveled the outer rim of a bogie, pushing the carriage off the tracks and against the pylons of a road bridge, causing it to collapse. The remaining train cars crashed into the wreckage, folding up on each other accordion style. In 3.5 seconds, the high-speed train came to a catastrophic halt. Only a lucky few survived.
I had the same grave kind of injuries as the dead. I was really lucky that I was not among the dead, as I had the same serious injuries as the dead.
Hier hatten wir dann plötzlich ganz viele Tote und wenn man da...
There were so many dead. And when you have to come to terms with that, there were children, adults, the elderly. It was disturbing beyond anything I had ever known before.
Die ich vorher auch gar nicht gekannt habe.
The inquiry lasted 53 days and led to manslaughter charges for at least 2 Deutsche Bahn employees. The accident eventually changed train safety and improved emergency response procedures in Germany, but left a nation shocked. Munich, Bavaria. It is early on the morning of June the 3rd, 1998, and commuters and families are boarding trains in the Munich Hauptbahnhof, headed north for business and pleasure. The I.C.E. 884 Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen is headed to Hamburg, with scheduled stops in the picturesque cities of Augsburg, Nuremberg, Würzburg, Fulda, Kassel, Göttingen and Hanover. When the doors finally close and the train pulls out of the station, 287 passengers are on board, settling into their travel routines. Udo Bauch was on a business trip to Hamburg and boarded the I.C.E. in Fulda. He knew the voyage would be fast and smooth, and he'd be able to get a little work done en route. He was sitting alone in first class, coach 11.
The weather was very nice that day. It was a summer day, and my trip started well. My wife brought me to the station, and I got on the train. I wanted to go to Hamburg that day. I knew, in any case, that day I wanted to work and was alone in the coach. I had my laptop with me because I wanted to work in peace and quiet, so I had no other passengers with me, and I had planned it that way, so I could work in peace.
About 130 kilometers south of Hamburg, with only 40 minutes left to the final destination, it quickly became clear there was something serious amiss in Coach 1. Unusual vibrations had been noticed by previous passengers, and now something even worse happened. A steel shaft shot through the armrest of Jörg Dittmann, a passenger in Coach 1. Rather than pull the emergency brake, he went to find a ticket collector, who told him it was company policy to investigate before stopping the train. All of a sudden, the rear coaches began travelling on a different set of rails, hurtling horizontally towards the bridge, slamming into it. The bridge collapsed onto the train, crushing the rear half of Coach 5. The restaurant coach, 6, was completely crushed to just 15 centimeters in height. There was no chance of survival for anyone dining in coach 6 at the time of the accident. The remaining cars jackknifed into one another.
I looked up at the clock, and I was working on my laptop, and then all of a sudden there was a blow, an impact like nothing I had ever heard. And from then on, it all went very fast. Then, within the coach, I was thrown about, over and under, and from left to right. All sorts of chairs and train parts were flying against me, until I was just suddenly lying there, and I knew something terrible had happened. I thought 2 trains had collided.
I heard over the radio what was happening while on my way to Eschede. And then, as we neared Eschede, we were able to speak to the mayor, who was able to tell us that it's an I.C.E. train, it's completely destroyed, and the bridge is also completely destroyed. And it all looks quite horrific. That was the first information I had.
Also schon auf dem Weg dahin war durch den Funkverkehr, den man ja
We could hear the radio traffic as we were on our way to Eschede, but it was confused information, as the various frequencies and traffic were all over the place, and it was difficult to make out.
genau auszumachen, aber es war alles völlig busy. Und als wir dann nach Eschede kamen und auch auf diesen Brückenkopf...
Then, as I came to Eschede and drove up to the top of where the bridge was, there lay the I.C.E. train, totally destroyed. I had never seen anything like it. I was perplexed, as I was not at all trained for what lay before me.
War ich in dem Sinne auch gar nicht vorbereitet.
2 Deutsche Bahn railway technicians who had been doing maintenance near the bridge would be killed instantly when car number 4 came hurtling toward them at 200 kilometers per hour.
Der dritte Wagen.
The back of the third wagon went onto a different rail, and then it derailed, and the back of the wagon hit the bridge pylon, and it began to collapse. The fourth wagon was able to come under the bridge, and then the bridge collapsed onto wagon 5, destroying it completely. Then the other wagons just piled up against the bridge.
Dann die anderen Wagen haben sich dann vor der Brücke zusammengeschoben.
The front power car, which had detached from the rest of the train, coasted for another 3 kilometers until coming to a stop just past Eschede railway station. Residents in the tiny town just 130 kilometers south of Hamburg had no idea what was happening just south of their normally quiet and tidy German village. Andreas Effinghausen was one of the first police officers to arrive at the bridge from Celle.
Und als wir dann dort ankamen,
As I came into town, I stopped the car and got out to go on foot, and that's when I saw that the bridge was completely down. So I went down along the embankment by the bridge, and I saw the train, and a whole wagon had been split open. And as I looked around, I thought, what am I going to do here? I just had no idea what to do next.
und dann habe ich da erstmal gestanden und war völlig fassungslos. Ich wusste gar nicht, was ich machen sollte.
Once I came to this sudden halt and was lying there. I was totally pinned, and my leg was pinned, and I couldn't move. I could only cry out and hope that someone found me.
Es war allerdings nicht zu hören, es war absolute Ruhe.
You couldn't hear anything. There was complete silence, not a sound. So I went down around the train and I simply called out, "Hello?" And Udo Bauch answered me.
Hat Udo Bauch mir geantwortet.
Hello, hello, is anyone there? He yelled. And I heard it, and I tried to pull myself up and say, yes, my name is Ugo Bauch, please help me.
The local fire chief, Gerd Backerberg, immediately began to organize the emergency response.
Ja, das
The disaster site was about 500, 600 meters total, since the first 5 wagons had come under the bridge, and the others were all piled on top of each other along the track. One wagon was lying beneath the destroyed bridge, and all the others were folded up like an accordion in front of the bridge. An hour and a half later, the district government had declared a civil state of emergency. Immediately after the train derailment on June 3, 1998, more than 100 rescue workers from around the region were dispatched to the scene, and within hours, more than 1,800 personnel had arrived. Edvard Hüls was the emergency room physician on duty in the nearby city of Celle and immediately rushed to the disaster site to help.
The first thing I thought as I was standing there was, what am I even going to do here? It is a question one asks oneself. You suddenly understand what it means when you have an education as a nursing assistant, and then suddenly your skills are going to be needed in a way that you could never have ever predicted or imagined.
A nearby hall was turned into an emergency triage center and makeshift morgue, as rescuers feverishly tried to extract the living from the wreckage.
The train was impenetrable due to the windows and the doors. This was a basic problem we had from the very beginning. And as a result, we could only treat the patients who we could get to in the very last wagons, put onto stretchers, and then begin doing triage that was needed.
We eventually gave up trying to make holes big enough in the doors and windows to get the patients out to be treated. At that point, the fire department helped us, and since the last 6 wagons were all lying next to each other, we were able to access the coaches through the aisles, cutting out the seats as we went through and slowly working from the back toward the front. But it was very difficult. Utter devastation was everywhere. For 20 minutes, rescuers stepped gingerly around live railway electrical cables carrying 15,000 volts. The train cars were horribly mangled, and rescuers struggled to reach the dozens of wounded and dying inside due to the impenetrable windows and doors. It was very difficult to get the wounded out of the train, but we were able to get to those we could reach quickly, and by 1400 hours, we had finished that part of the rescue. Between 14 and 1430, we had all the wounded people rescued and transported to nearby clinics or hospitals. It actually had gone fairly quickly. What had gone wrong with this train, the pride of Germany's railways? The first clue was that part of the railway line had penetrated the floor of carriage 1. Something had literally lifted the train off the track, and it could only have been a defective wheel. The first high-speed train debuted in Japan in 1965, but Germany was not far behind, adopting high-speed train travel with its intercity rail system in 1971. Germany's upgraded high-speed I.C.E. train service was launched to great fanfare in June 1991. They had speed up to 280 kilometers per hour, safety, comfort, and state-of-the-art engineering. Not surprisingly, the fast and comfortable trains with amenities like dining cars, telephone service, and entertainment made the trains popular from the outset.
This train was the flagship of the German fleet. It was important that it was seen to be operating properly and providing comfortable service for passengers. And it soon became apparent, though, there was a lot of transmission of noise and vibration into the carriages, particularly the restaurant cars and the other carriages. It was decided to try and solve this problem by introducing these rather peculiar wheels which had a separate rim separated from the hub by rubber pads.
Germany's I.C.E. trains were originally equipped with single-cast wheel sets, known as monoblock wheels, a design that engineers realized suffered from metal fatigue that caused vibration at cruising speed. They were, in essence, a legacy design. However, Deutsche Bahn exchanged them for new wheels based on streetcar wheels used on trams.
These wheels had been used very successfully in a lot of low-speed applications in tram systems. I think Hanover was one of the cities. There were others too that used them. And so they had some sort of pedigree, but they'd never been used for high-speed operations. They were successful in cutting down noise transmission, and so they proved to be in the I.C.E. trains for a considerable time. So things looked as if the problem had been solved.
The new and improved I.C.E. wheel tyre design consisted of a wheel body surrounded by a 20mm thick rubber damper and then a relatively thin metal rim. This successfully reduced the vibration at cruising speeds, but few tests were done on how the new rim design would hold up to the wear and tear of high-speed operation.
That is, a wear process takes place, and the shape of the wheel conforms more and more to the rounded shape of the rail head, which leads to unsatisfactory running of the train. So periodically the wheels are reprofiled after quite long periods of time. In these rimmed wheels, where the rim was separate from the hub of the wheel, this continual reprofiling reduced the thickness of the rim. And so the bending that took place every time the wheel rotated between the separate rim and the solid hub, separated by these rubber pads, grew greater because the rim became more flexible.
The Fraunhofer Institute for Structural Durability and System Reliability in Darmstadt presented 300 pages of expert testimony at the trial. They found that a cracking inside the rim of the wheel caused by excessive load and wear was responsible for the accident. Professor Roderick Smith is one of the engineers called in to find out what went wrong.
When the wheels were examined for cracks, in a normal solid wheel, one examines the outer tread of the wheel, where the cracks are likely to form between the wheel and the rail. On this occasion, nobody was examining the inside of the wheel, and so the crack remained undetected in inspections because it wasn't being looked for.
Engineers found that the rims became flattened into an elliptical shape as the wheel turned. Cracks could also form on the inside of this type of tyre, which was never tested in the entire 4 years it was in operation. But could regular maintenance have detected the worn-out rims? Many warning signs went unheeded. The world had never seen a high-speed rail crash of such epic, tragic proportions. The mangled cars of the I.C.E. 884 train Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen, en route from Munich to Hamburg, had not only derailed, but also hit an overpass, causing it to collapse onto the second half of the train, which then piled up in a zigzag motion. The biggest challenge at first was knowing the scale of the disaster. Just how many people had boarded the train?
Dieser ICE hatte ja eine Sitzplatzkapazität von 709.
The I.C.E. had a seating capacity of 795 seats. The emergency manager of the Deutsche Bahn came to the town and told us, "It's not like an airplane when you have assigned seats and check in and you can tell who is present or not, but rather people buy a ticket from point A to B, and whether or not they are on the train or decide to take another one, you do not know." But he said, based on this time of year, this time of the week, it was a Wednesday, and based on the time of day, that on the train they estimated there were approximately 200 to 300 people. And indeed, that proved to be correct.
Und das hat sich dann nachher auch bestätigt.
By 2 p.m., they had a full picture of what they faced. 124 injured, more than 80 of them seriously. 16 had walked away, and 101 dead and dying in the impenetrable or crushed train cars.
Also unverletzte oder leicht verletzte Personen.
Lightly wounded or those without injuries were in the first 3 wagons. In the 4th wagon were more gravely wounded, but after the 5th wagon, it was mostly just dead.
In Wagen 5 waren dann Tote zu beklagen.
Lying in pain, pinned beneath parts of his coach, Udo Bauch saw his life flash before his eyes.
And then you see these near-death images that flash through your head. From your childhood, your youth, when you become a parent, the night you met your wife, the whole life ran through my head, and I knew either I am going to die or somehow I will come out of this. And then, at a certain point, I heard the voice of my rescuer, Andrea, a policeman from Celle, who I am still friends with today. And I was a bit more reassured that someone had found me.
Hat mich dann gebeten, seine Frau zu verständigen.
He begged me to contact his wife. He gave me names and a phone number and asked me to call. I asked him about his injuries and he said that he thought that his entire left side must be broken. He was in a lot of pain, so I told him I would go and get a doctor. And we would try to get him out as fast as possible.
Retter ranhole, dass wir ihn da rausbekommen.
My wife had to search for me. She had brought me to the train platform and then gone home and heard about the derailment. Then she noted the train's name, Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen. She heard it on the television and she thought, that is the train. My husband is inside. Then she made contact with the authorities, who gave her a long list of hospitals where the various patients were. And she had to call and call. But the answer everywhere was negative. And then the next to the last one was the hospital in Hanover. And there they had an unknown patient wearing blue pants, a wedding ring with the name Monica engraved into it, and was approximately 30 years old. And it was with this glimmer of hope that she went to Hanover to search for me.
Udo's rescuer, Andreas Effinghausen, also went to see him at the hospital. He was met by Monica, relieved to have finally found her husband and be at his side.
Ja, also sie hat mich erstmal ganz herzlich begrüßt.
First, she warmly said hello to me, and then we went up to intensive care to see Udo. He wasn't totally conscious, he was still in a medically induced coma. But later he told me he could hear my voice.
Hat gehört, dass ich da war, also er hat die Stimme gehört, aber er konnte eben halt noch nicht antworten.
ER physician Dr. Edvard Hüls was confronted with the most difficult choice a doctor can face.
To be in a situation where so many patients need your help. They were all trying to talk to me and say, we need a doctor. And I had my kit with me so they could recognize me as a real doctor from afar. And they all thought, oh, he will come right away. Yet he is not coming over to me. It is not something you can train for. Getting through those very difficult moments and decisions was very hard. I couldn't care for some of the patients, even when I knew things were going quite badly for them.
Also ich sag mal, das war eigentlich das Schlimmste.
It was one of the worst experiences I've ever had. I've seen many road accidents, and I've seen many injured people as a policeman. But so many people, such a massive accident scene. This was almost impossible for me. It took a long time for me to get my head around all that had happened. For that reason, still today, I remember every detail. I'll never forget it.
Ich weiß heute noch genau jedes Detail, also ich werde das auch nicht vergessen.
The accident took 6 days to clear so that trains could resume running on the busy Munich to Hamburg line.
Wir haben tatsächlich bei einer Lagefeststellung nachmittags 15 Uhr
At a certain rescue site, we, at a certain point at 1500 hours, reported that we had 1,250 vehicles working directly on site.
Dort waren rund 350.
There had been a total of 1,800 vehicles, including 350 trucks that were attached to various entities, as well as 39 aircraft, which was the biggest air response in the history of the German Republic since the war.
Insgesamt in diesem Einsatz 39 Luftfahrzeuge eingebunden gewesen.
Forensic teams began the grim task of collecting body parts in small grey trays. Entire families were wiped out in 3.5 seconds. The train had started in southern Germany, and there were many, many families, especially children with their mothers on their way to the North Sea, and in the end we had more than 30 dead children. But it could have been even worse. Another high-speed train had just passed under the very same bridge. Udo Bauch was disabled.
I had third-degree head injuries, jaw fractured in 4 places, skull fractures, and my left leg was broken. I had multiple fractures. Everything was broken. I had the same grave injuries as the dead. And I was really lucky not to be among the dead, because I had many of the same injuries as the dead.
The extent of grief in the tiny village was overwhelming. A special trauma team moved into the back of the small hall that had been turned into triage center and morgue. The psychological support team would remain in place for over a year at a center erected in the nearby city of Celle, and eventually become a model for trauma counseling and disaster response in Germany. Through the police and the border patrol, we brought in psychological teams and cared for the wounded, the relatives who were arriving, and also later on, also the rescuers who were on site. Later, a counseling center was erected in the nearby town of Celle with a pastor, a psychologist, and a typist who worked alongside them. And this center was in service for over a year and a half. The accident happened in a matter of seconds, but the catastrophe was actually set in motion by one wholly preventable failure: a tiny fatigue crack in the steel tire on a wheel of the third axle of the first car.
Suddenly the rim fractured and sort of spread itself out like a spear and came up through the seat of one of the passengers was sitting there, and it came up through his seat and caused considerable concern, of course. The passenger rushed to the guard, who was several carriages away from him, to tell him what had happened and to stop the train. Apparently the guard was rather slow in reacting, but started walking with the passenger back to the site of the damage. But before they could get there, the trailing end of the rim caught on a set of points below the train and derailed one of the bogies of the carriage that the train was on.
So what went wrong? 3 separate automated checks indicated a defect in the I.C.E. train's wheels. The train's onboard computer also showed that conductors and other train staff had filed 8 separate complaints about noises and other vibrations being generated by the defective wheel, yet the company did not replace it. The train conductor also failed to stop the train in time.
Of course, it's relatively easy to run computer models, quite complicated computer models, but the question is, are we modelling the right thing? And that can only be answered by testing. And here the structure was so different from the conventional wheel that testing would have revealed the difference in the structure and the different location of where the cracks were going to form. The fact that if a crack was going to initiate, it would be initiated on the inside of the rim, which normally is not a place you would look at because it would be part of a solid wheel. And the fact that the reprofiling process had not been rethought to accommodate the separate rim. I think these are actually very fundamental issues.
But while the disintegrated wheel might have been the root cause of the accident, the damage became catastrophic due to the proximity of the bridge and the position of the wheel on a car at the front end of the train, which led to such a large number of cars derailing.
If the train had been stopped immediately the accident would have happened, the disaster might have been avoided. And one of the ways in which that could have happened was if the driver had some indication that there was a major fault on one of the bogies. He actually had an indication of the level of the toilet water in each of the carriages, but not on the condition of the bogies.
The relathing of the wheels had created a microscopic crack on the inner surface of the outer rim that failed.
They examined carefully all the wheels on the similar trains. They found, interestingly, that only the wheels that had been reprofiled, I think 6 times, had cracks inside. And of the population that had been reprofiled 6 times, I think 80% of them had little cracks there that could have grown quickly. Of the wheels that hadn't been reprofiled 6 times, but less times, they didn't find any cracks. So clearly, the limit of the reprofiling had been exceeded, and it caused them to rethink the whole business, and they went back to running on solid wheels.
The snapped rim shot into the seat in carriage 1, but also hooked a set of points on the railway line that pushed the following carriage onto a parallel set of rails. The carriages crashed into the bridge, which fell onto them, and the end of the train piled up against the crashed carriage at 200 kilometers per hour. If the dragging rail rim hadn't switched the points, the crash simply would not have happened.
So what we had was the initial breakage of the wheel unleashed a series of incidents, each of which compounded the consequences, and the final consequence, of course, was the disaster when the train hit the bridge.
Embittered survivors and relatives of those killed accused Deutsche Bahn of ignoring wheel fatigue during previous wheel checks.
Well, a legal process was applied. I don't think it was as searching as it might have been, and if it had have been, I think it may have come to a conclusion that really shifted more of the responsibility for this onto bad design at Deutsche Bahn.
In 2003, a German court abandoned negligence cases against 3 Deutsche Bahn engineers, fining each of them €10,000 and concluding they bore no serious blame for the disaster.
The trial was very painful because the outcome was such that no one was found guilty. The fact that the engineers were given just a mild fine. The outcome of the trial was for the survivors and the families of the victims, well, it was like a slap in the face.
More than 20 years after Germany's worst rail accident, many things have changed. The Eschede disaster was one of the tragic events that led to the creation of a new federal agency in 2002 and the establishment of a psychosocial emergency care network across Germany. Edward Hüls is still one of the lead emergency doctors in the timbered German city of Celle. The approach, he recalls, was innovative at the time.
Wir haben dieses Psychologie-Team nicht mitgebracht. Das gab es zu der damaligen Zeit überhaupt gar nicht.
We developed the psychological trauma team concept ourselves, because back then such a thing did not exist. Eschede was the first disaster where a team of counselors were brought on site to address the needs of not just the grieving and wounded, but also the rescuers who were working there. When rescuers would come out of the wreckage, they could stop in for a briefing, talk to someone. At the time, this was something very new.
Dann haben wir ein Briefing hinterher, wir sprechen mit euch. Das war etwas ganz, ganz Neues.
Within weeks, points on the entire German railway network were checked to see if they were near possible obstacles.
They then instigated a big investigation. They contacted a lot of experts of fatigue, because this failure was clearly a fatigue crack that had grown in the rim, of which I was one. We spent two and a half years arguing with each other, discussing with DB engineers, trying to find out the history of the decision to introduce these wheels, what the testing had been, what the thoughts had been about the inspection of them, and so on.
Wheels on other trains were replaced with the safer monoblock type.
My argument would be is the protocols weren't applicable to this particular incident. Stripped away from the overall view, the detail of the design of the wheel was so different, they shouldn't have applied existing design standards to it. And they shouldn't have hidden behind the fact that it complied with those existing design standards, because it was a completely different structure and it changed the system behaviour.
Trains were also refitted with windows that have predetermined braking seams, as rescue workers at the scene of the disaster had difficulty reaching victims due to the resistance of the train's pressure-proof windows. After 27 days in a medically induced coma and 6 major operations, Udo Bauch lives with a 100% handicap.
Ich habe nach wie vor, auch jetzt noch nach 20 Jahren, sehr starke Schmerzen immer wieder.
I still have very strong pain, even today, after 20 years. When I walk, it all hurts. I have a 100% handicap. There is also anxiety. My life is very, very different, and every day I have to fight through this pain and these obstacles and handicaps.
Udo Bauch decided to build his own memorial and began planning a chapel in his hometown of Eichenzell.
Many people come here. In the first year after the accident, we had 5,000 visitors. We get prayer groups, victim support groups. And it is nice to see that our town is sought out by those who want the victims of the Eschede disaster to be remembered.
Udo Bauch only received an apology some 20 years after the accident, after having to fight Deutsche Bahn every step of the way.
Deutsche Bahn was very insensitive in the time right after the disaster. They sent us letters with I.C.E. train stamps. You had to fight for every single euro of compensation. At the time, everyone said, "We will absolutely compensate you big time." But as a victim, we did not notice that. We had to fight for every little thing. Every little bill that needed to be paid was a battle. It was a very heavy burden.
Nearly 3 years after the disaster, an official memorial was established, paid for in part by Deutsche Bahn. "400 relatives and many dignitaries, as well as rescue personnel and local Eschede residents, attended the opening ceremony. Still today, many continue to gather here on the solemn anniversary of the accident every June. "101 wild Japanese cherry trees were planted here, one for each fatality. They do not bear fruit, but blossom every spring in memory of the victims. A place of solace and reflection for families, rescuers, and the villagers of Eschede whose lives go on, despite being forever marked by the tragedy. In one's life, one can never forget the images that one at the time had to live through on the 3rd of June 1998. And every year, when the anniversary of the disaster comes around, those pictures inevitably come back, and our thoughts go back to all those who lost their lives in the derailment.
The memories retreated a little bit into the background, but they're still there, because every now and then I drive over and stop for a moment, looking, standing there for a brief time, and then I see everything before my eyes, just as it was.
Passengers in the trains that speed by here every day at 200 kilometers per hour on their way to and from Hamburg are traveling too fast to see the names of all those who lost their lives here on June the 3rd, 1998. But if they happen to look out the window toward the thick forests and fields of heather as they pass by Eschede, their gaze is met by a cherry orchard planted to remember the 101 dead, and by a steep flight of stone steps leading up to a gate, framing the blue heavens beyond.